Picture the scene. It's September in the year 1850. The bells are literally ringing in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah. Huge celebrations.
Right. The streets are just filled with this palpable sense of relief. And you've got these prominent, moderate politicians, and they're celebrating in the halls of Congress because they've just struck this massive, historic deal.
A huge legislative package.
Exactly. This sweeping piece of legislation that supposedly resolves the bitter, grinding tension between the North and the South. I mean, they are patting each other on the back, praising their own pragmatism.
They really thought they had saved the world. Or, well, the Union, anyway.
Yeah, they're celebrating the fact that they just saved the Union from a bloody civil war. And to be fair, they actually did.
They did. They bought the country, what, an entire decade of peace.
A whole decade. But, and here is the really dark part, woven into that celebrated compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act.
Which was just a catastrophic piece of legislation.
Right. It mandated the brutal capture and return of escaped enslaved people. It basically forced citizens in free states to actively, participate in the machinery of slavery.
It's honestly one of the most chilling examples in history of what a so-called deal can actually look like once you peel back the layers.
Yeah.
Because when you look back at that specific moment, the moderate politicians of the time, they viewed themselves as heroes. They reached across the aisle.
They did the pragmatic thing.
Right. But for the actual human beings whose lives and, frankly, whose freedom were traded away just to secure that temporary peace, it was an absolute unmitigated betrayal.
And that profound disconnect, that exact friction is what we're exploring today. Because, that sinking feeling you get when you're like watching the evening news and you see a group of modern politicians standing at a podium.
Smiling for the cameras.
Exactly. And they're using all those incredibly polished buzzwords like moving the country forward and finding middle ground.
Always the middle ground.
Right. But you're sitting there watching it and you look at the fine print of the legislation and you just find yourself wondering, was that a necessary evil to keep the government functioning? Or did they just completely sell out?
Did they trade away something fundamental?
Yeah, just to secure a photo op and a temporary political win. It's so hard to tell sometimes.
It is a totally universal frustration for voters. And it stems from this really profound cognitive dissonance in how we're all raised.
How so?
Well, think about it. We are taught from a very young age that standing up for your principles is the ultimate virtue. Like the hero never compromises, right?
Right, the hero holds the line.
Exactly. But then, almost in the same breath, we are also taught that sharing, compromising, and finding middle ground is just the basic requirement for participating in a civilized society.
Oh, that's such a good point. Like play nice in the sandbox.
Yeah. So when those two completely contradictory virtues collide on the national stage, especially when the stakes are, healthcare or civil rights or economic survival, it just creates immense friction.
Because we don't have a way to process it.
We really don't. We simply do not have a robust vocabulary to differentiate between a noble compromise and a toxic one.
Which is exactly why we are taking a deep dive today into this fascinating philosophical breakdown we received. It's simply titled, Question 93, Is Political Compromise a Virtue or a Betrayal?
It's a brilliant document. Really gets into the mechanics of it all.
It really does. And our mission for you today, listening to this, is to build a mental toolkit. By the time we're done here, we want you to be able to look at the next big political deal in the news and actually possess the analytical framework to distinguish between what is just a necessary, somewhat ugly political imperfection and what is an unacceptable, flat-out injustice.
Which is a very hard line to draw sometimes.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to even begin, we have to recognize the massive paradox at the heart of this entire issue.
We do. We have to look at the dual nature of both refusing to compromise and agreeing to compromise. Because according to the source, neither path is inherently purely good or purely evil.
Which kind of goes against our gut instinct, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, if a political faction draws a hard line in the sand and flatly refuses to compromise, yeah, they might be protecting a really vital moral line.
They could be defending justice against a totally corrupt establishment.
Right. But the text asks us to look at the mechanical result of that total refusal. Because a total refusal to compromise, when it's adopted by enough factions, produces complete governmental paralysis.
Nothing.
Nothing. It creates this creeping extremism where factions become increasingly isolated and aggressive.
Yeah.
And it just guarantees an endless, grinding conflict where absolutely nothing actually gets solved.
Right, because if you're operating within a system that's literally designed for collective decision-making and nobody is willing to give an inch, the machine doesn't just slow down.
The gears totally lock up.
Yeah, the engine overheats and the entire structure stops functioning. I mean, we've seen this in recent years with government shutdowns, right?
Absolutely.
Where basic services are just suspended because a really small faction refuses to authorize a budget without getting their entire unedited wish list.
Precisely. But then, the source points out that we have to look at the mechanism on the other side of the coin. If factions do compromise, well, the gears turn. They create peace.
They pass the budgets.
They pass budgets, they build vital infrastructure, they fund schools, and they keep the society functioning. But, and this is a huge but, compromise carries its own really insidious risk.
The normalization of bad behavior.
Yes. As the analysis points out, compromise can easily normalize corruption. If you consistently compromise with bad actors, you end up normalizing profound injustice, and you are eventually led into completely unacceptable moral concessions.
So it's like a slow poison.
Exactly. So the goal of our conversation today isn't to ask the simplistic question of if we should compromise. We already know the system demands it.
Right.
The real framework we need to establish in the text is this: what is negotiable, and what must never, ever be traded away?
Okay, so before we dissect the really dark stuff, the toxic deals and the historical betrayals, we need to establish why the system requires this kind of dealing to function at all.
We have to start with the baseline, yeah.
Because it's very easy to just sit on the sidelines, watch the news, and demand absolute ideological purity from your favorite politician. But the reality of human existence is far more complex. And I think we need to ground ourselves in why political flexibility isn't just a nice option, but a structural necessity.
And according to the source material, the absolute strongest defense of compromise begins with a structural concept called pluralism.
Pluralism. Okay, break that down for us.
Well, when we look at modern societies, we are looking at massive populations packed with people who hold genuinely different, deeply rooted beliefs.
Right, we're not all the same.
Far from it.
Yeah.
And we aren't talking about superficial differences here. We are talking about fundamental disagreements on the nature of religion, on the ethics of taxation, on the foundational purpose of education.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah, on how markets should be regulated, and on the very definitions of freedom and equality.
And these aren't just minor policy tweaks for people. These are core identity issues. I mean, these are the organizing principles of people's entire lives.
Exactly. And the crucial mechanism to understand about pluralism, which the text highlights, is that these deep differences do not just evaporate simply because one side firmly believes they are right.
Or even if they can empirically prove they're right.
Yes. You can be 100% convinced of your moral righteousness. You can have all the data on your side. But the people who oppose you are often just as deeply convinced of their own righteousness.
Backed by their own values and their own lived experiences.
Exactly. Disagreement in a democracy does not automatically mean that the opposing side is inherently evil or completely ignorant. People can, and they do, reasonably disagree about incredibly difficult, complex questions of resource allocation and moral priorities.
It reminds me of trying to plan a huge family vacation.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. Like, think about democratic pluralism. Like, planning a multi-generational family vacation where everyone wants something wildly different. You've got the teenagers who want to sleep all day and go to the beach. You've got the grandparents who want to do historical bus tours at 6 a.m.
And someone just wants to sit at the hotel bar.
Exactly. Now, if everyone demands 100% total victory, if the grandparents say, we are only doing historical tours or we aren't going, then no one goes anywhere. The vacation completely collapses.
Right.
Or, the government collapses.
What's fascinating here is how accurately that analogy maps onto the psychology of governing. If every political faction adopts the structural rigidity of saying, I will accept nothing except total victory, then political cooperation becomes entirely impossible.
The family stays home and just yells at each other.
Pretty much. Compromise is the flex that allows people who disagree deeply to actually occupy the same physical territory, to pass binding laws, and to share institutions.
So in that sense, compromise isn't a weakness. It's not a dilution of your values. It's literally the mechanical grease in the gears.
It is the basic operating condition of democratic life. But the text argues it goes deeper than just the practical mechanics of getting a bill passed. There is a profound moral argument embedded here as well.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the moral argument for giving up what you want?
The source frames compromise as a form of political humility and mutual respect. When you engage in a genuine compromise, you are essentially transmitting a message to your political opponents and to the broader society.
What's the message?
You're saying, I believe my position is the correct one, but I recognize that I do not own this political community. I recognize that you are also a citizen, you also have a stake in this structure, and your voice matters too.
Wow, that requires a massive ego check.
It really does.
It requires a politician or even just an everyday voter to actively acknowledge that their faction does not hold a monopoly on reality, which is really hard to do when you feel so strongly about something.
It is. And we have to look at the immense tangible value of that humility when we scale it up to matters of deep, deep conflict.
Like what?
Well, when we're talking about disputes over national territory or deep-seated ethnic divisions or the constitutional balance of power, the text points out that these are areas where the alternative to compromise isn't just a stalled legislative agenda.
Right, it's not just a delayed budget.
No, the alternative is civil conflict. It is institutional collapse. It is actual physical violence.
The stakes are literal life and death. If the building snaps, people die.
Precisely. Sometimes neither side can achieve total victory without unleashing enormous, devastating violence upon the other. So a compromise in those high-stakes situations, it may be deeply imperfect. It might leave every single party feeling disappointed and aggrieved.
But it stops the bleeding.
Yes. It may prevent the outbreak of widespread violence. In those specific contexts, the text argues compromise is morally valuable because the alternative to a compromised, imperfect peace isn't perfect justice. The alternative is continued, horrific suffering.
Okay, so if compromise is this vital flex in the skyscraper, if it's this noble exercise in political humility and the prevention of violence, why does it so often feel so incredibly dirty to us?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because we have all watched politicians announce a compromise, and it rarely looks like a beautiful act of mutual respect. It usually looks totally cynical. It looks like backroom dealing.
Yeah, it often does.
So if we accept that the system requires this flex, how do we distinguish between a necessary structural joint and a completely rotten beam?
Well, according to the source, that requires a shift in how we analyze the mechanics of decision-making. The conversation has to pivot from the lofty ideals of democratic theory to the dangerous, messy realities of human ambition.
Because politicians are humans with human flaws.
Exactly. Because from the outside, a noble compromise and a cynical betrayal look mechanically identical. In both cases, a politician is giving up a stated goal.
Okay, the source outlines a scenario that I think plays out in almost every single election cycle.
Oh, absolutely.
A politician campaigns on this fierce, unyielding principle. They wick up their base. They promise to fight the establishment to the bitter end for this specific transformative cause.
They raise a ton of money on it.
Oh, tons of money. And then, the very moment they gain a seat at the table, they abandon that principle. But they don't abandon it to save the country from civil war. They abandon it because it's inconvenient.
Yeah, or for a bump in their polling numbers.
Exactly. Or they get a favorable committee assignment. Or maybe a major corporate donor quietly threatened to pull their funding.
And in that scenario, the text is very clear. The voters have every right to feel a profound sense of betrayal. Mechanically, yes, the politician yielded ground. But the difference depends entirely on the internal architecture of that decision.
The why behind it.
Exactly. Why was the ground yielded?
Yeah.
How vital was the principle being surrendered? And what exactly was gained for the public in return? The text defines it this way. A genuine compromise sacrifices a preference for legitimate shared outcome that benefits the whole structure. A betrayal, on the other hand, sacrifices a fundamental principle merely for the preservation of the politician's own power, comfort, or career trajectory.
Wait, but I want to push back on this idea that sacrificing for a legitimate shared outcome is always a clean equation.
That's a fair pushback.
Because isn't compromise often just a sanitized, focus-grouped term for throwing vulnerable populations under the bus? I mean, when politicians make a deal to balance a budget and the compromise involves, say, cutting a program that feeds hungry children, the politicians who struck the deal, they still get to eat steak at their victory dinner that night.
They absolutely do.
Right. The only people feeling the actual weight of the so-called compromise are the children who lose their meals. It doesn't seem like the politicians are sacrificing anything at all.
That is a vital distinction, and it gets to the heart of what the text calls the most dangerous mechanism of compromise: the illusion of progress.
The illusion of progress. Tell me more about that.
Well, you asked how making a system manageable preserves injustice. Let's look at the mechanics of a pressure release valve. The source uses historical examples here, things like segregation or colonial rule.
Okay, massive systemic injustices.
Right. Imagine the pressure against that injustice is building. The marginalized group is organizing, protests are happening, and the unjust system is threatening to rupture entirely.
The boiler is about to blow.
Exactly. If the ruling class offers a tiny cosmetic compromise, let's call it a 5% concession, it acts as a release valve.
Oh, I see. So it bleeds off the revolutionary energy without actually fixing the core issue.
Exactly. The 5% concession doesn't dismantle the oppression, but it does something far more insidious, according to the text. It puts the moderate majority back to sleep.
Wow.
The secure, comfortable citizens see that 5% concession on the evening news and they say, ah, wonderful, the system is working, the problem is solved. And the momentum for the necessary 100% structural fix is entirely killed. The injustice has been made politically manageable, it has been stabilized.
That is deeply unsettling. It implies that if a horrific system is facing collapse due to its own cruelty, a small compromise actually acts as life support for that cruelty.
Yeah.
It literally rescues the unjust system from its own consequences.
It does. And this challenges us to shift our analytical perspective entirely. The source argues that we cannot evaluate a compromise from the perspective of the secure politicians making the deal in a comfortable boardroom.
Because they aren't paying the price.
Right. We must evaluate it from the perspective of the vulnerable groups who are being asked to absorb the cost of that deal. For the powerful, a compromise that slightly tweaks an unjust system looks reasonable. It looks pragmatic.
But for the victims of that system, it looks like a demand that they negotiate over their own humanity.
Precisely. The text notes the victims of systemic injustice are constantly told by the comfortable, secure political class to be patient. They are told to accept gradual progress.
Don't rock the boat.
Yeah, they're warned not to demand too much too fast, lest they upset the political order. This essentially demands that marginalized people treat their basic dignity and fundamental rights as bargaining chips in someone else's strategic game.
Which brings us to the concept of absolute boundaries. Because if we are establishing a framework for what is negotiable and what isn't, what are the lines that can never be crossed? According to the text, what can never be a bargaining chip?
The analysis establishes incredibly strict boundaries here. It argues that while policy preferences, things like tax rates, zoning laws, or infrastructure spending, are always negotiable, fundamental rights are not.
Like what, specifically?
The source lists specific protections. Protection from state-sanctioned torture, the guarantee of equal citizenship, basic political enfranchisement, and protection from arbitrary violence. These must never be subject to compromise.
So you can negotiate the tax code, but you can't negotiate someone's right to exist safely.
Exactly. A healthy democracy absolutely relies on negotiation to function, but true justice requires ironclad limits to that negotiation.
Okay, this leads us right into a massive philosophical dilemma. If compromising with injustice is this highly toxic mechanism that functions as a pressure release valve for oppression and asks victims to negotiate away their dignity,
Right.
then shouldn't a truly virtuous, heroic leader simply refuse to compromise altogether? I mean, if the political machinery is fundamentally dirty, shouldn't you just keep your hands clean and refuse to play the game?
It is an incredibly seductive instinct, but the source warns that it is also a highly dangerous trap. It is what the text identifies as the purity trap.
The purity trap. Meaning prioritizing the feeling of your own moral cleanliness over actually doing the dirty work of governing.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It's the prioritization of moral purity over tangible human well-being. What happens mechanically is that political actors become so terrified of being tainted by an imperfect system, or so obsessed with maintaining their brand as an uncompromising warrior, that they refuse to join any coalition that doesn't meet their exact specifications.
They won't vote for anything unless it's flawless.
Right. They refuse to vote for any policy that contains even a single flaw. The text outlines this mathematical dilemma they reach, where they would genuinely prefer to lose completely, keeping their ideological purity perfectly intact over achieving only a portion of what they believe is good.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the ultimate manifestation of the perfect is the enemy of the good paradox.
It really is.
Let's frame this with a different analogy to make it super concrete. Let's say you are a doctor in an emergency triage situation after a massive natural disaster.
Okay, high stakes.
Very high stakes. You have limited supplies. You have a medical protocol that says the only way to treat a certain severe injury is with a specific, highly sterilized surgical environment, which you do not have.
It's a disaster zone.
Right. You only have a makeshift tent and some basic antiseptics. Now, using the tent means a higher risk of infection. It is deeply imperfect. It violates your ideal standard of care. But if you refuse to operate in the tent because it violates your pure medical principles, the patients die immediately.
Wow.
So, do you refuse the 60% survival rate because you demand 100%? Is that holding to your medical principles, or is that a horrific form of professional vanity? The dying patient doesn't care about your pristine track record. They just want a chance to live.
This raises an important question, and your analogy perfectly illustrates the distinction the source makes between genuine moral courage and performative vanity. We have to separate the two mathematically.
How do we do that?
Well, genuine moral courage, as we established earlier with the boundaries, is drawing a line at those non-negotiable rights. It is saying an absolute no to corruption, to the persecution of minorities, or to the dismantling of democratic institutions. In those specific instances, refusal is a virtue. To compromise there would be complicity in the destruction of the system itself.
Right, you can't compromise on torture.
Exactly. But the vanity side of the equation operates differently.
How so?
The vanity side occurs when a politician's refusal to accept partial progress leads directly to very real, highly preventable suffering.
Give me an example from the political world.
Okay, if a leader rejects a bill that would secure housing for, say, 60% of the homeless population simply because it doesn't house 100%, they might look incredibly principled on television. Their most radical base might cheer for their unyielding stance on social media.
They didn't sell out.
Right. But if the refusal means 0 people get housing and they actively produce a worse outcome for the exact vulnerable population they claim to champion, then it ceases to be moral courage. It is vanity.
It's all about them.
It is the politician prioritizing their own ideological reflection in the mirror over the actual material lives of their constituents.
So if we accept that taking the 60% solution, operating in that imperfect triage tent, is sometimes the morally necessary and responsible thing to do, how do we prevent that 60% from becoming the permanent standard?
That is the real danger.
Because the risk here is that if you accept the 60%, the political establishment just pats themselves on the back and says, great, problem solved, we don't need to talk about housing anymore. How do we prevent an imperfect compromise from becoming a permanent ceiling on justice?
That is the pivotal transition in the source material, moving from political theory to the actual anatomy of a deal.
Yeah.
How do you structure a compromise in the real world so it doesn't become a ceiling? The framework relies heavily on evaluating time horizons.
Time horizons, okay.
The moral architecture of a deal changes entirely depending on whether the compromise is explicitly temporary or intentionally permanent.
Walk us through the mechanics of that, because temporary and permanent are terms politicians throw around constantly to justify their votes.
The evaluation of a deal hinges on the honesty of its temporal limits. Let's examine a temporary compromise first. This is a mechanism where political actors state publicly, we are accepting this deeply flawed policy right now, today, as a strategic, mechanical step towards something better.
So they don't pretend it's perfect.
No, they do not hide the imperfection. They actively acknowledge it, but they utilize the flawed deal to improve conditions immediately while structurally keeping the door open for future expansive progress.
I see. So it's like a legislative stepping stone.
Exactly.
Like, for example, a state legislature says, we only have the votes and the budget to fund universal pre-K for our lowest income districts this year. It's geographically unequal, which we hate, but we are writing the legislation so that the program automatically expands to the rest of the state over the next 5 years as revenues increase.
That's a great real-world application.
They acknowledge the current injustice of the geographical split, but they engineer the bill to eventually resolve it.
Yes, that is a strategic use of compromise. But a permanent compromise operates on a completely different psychological and structural level. This is when political actors decide, we have fought hard enough, this flawed policy is good enough, we are closing the book on this issue.
Oh, wow. So they just wash their hands of it.
Exactly. When you make a permanent compromise that leaves a serious systemic injustice intact, you are no longer operating strategically. The text argues you are surrendering. If accepting a deal permanently locks in a barrier to equality, or if the very act of passing the deal destroys the grassroots political momentum required for deeper reform, then the compromise becomes actively toxic.
So the determining factor between a strategic stepping stone and a toxic surrender is radical transparency.
Transparency is everything.
The politicians have to be honest with the public about what the deal actually is. They have to stand at the podium and say, this is an ugly, imperfect half measure, rather than having their PR team spin it as a glorious total victory.
Which they almost never want to do.
Because the moment they sell a half measure as a total victory, they kill the public urgency needed to finish the job.
Precisely. The moral weight of the compromise rests on the leaders being entirely honest about whether they are accepting an imperfect step on a continuous path to justice, or if they are quietly, permanently abandoning the original principle altogether just to get the issue off their desk.
Okay, we've explored the math of the 60% compromise and the structural difference between temporary steps and permanent surrenders. But I want to dig into a deeper layer here, because we keep talking about meeting halfway. But who actually gets to draw the lines of what halfway even means?
Ah, right.
This brings us to the hidden mechanics of power. And I think this is where the framework in the text becomes truly indispensable for analyzing modern politics.
Power dynamics completely alter the moral landscape of any negotiation. The foundational assumption of a healthy, functioning political compromise is reciprocity.
Meaning both sides give something up.
It demands mutual concession. Both factions have to sacrifice something of relatively equal value. It requires operating in good faith, and it requires both sides to share the political risk of the outcome.
But reality is never a perfectly balanced scale. What happens mechanically when one side holds all the leverage?
The whole dynamic shifts.
Right. What happens when one faction controls the massive corporate wealth, the media institutions, and the levers of governmental power, while the opposing faction is just a marginalized group demanding basic, fundamental rights?
The source points out that when the distribution of power is vastly unequal, the entire moral meaning of the term negotiation is corrupted. Imagine the powerful faction, the one holding all the systemic advantages, looks at the weaker faction and says, let's be reasonable adults here, let's compromise, meet us halfway.
But their halfway is totally skewed.
Exactly, because the established status quo already heavily disproportionately benefits the powerful side. Demanding that the weaker side meet them halfway is a fundamentally unjust equation.
I want to highlight a specific phrase from the analysis here because it is just brilliant. It states that when one group is forced to repeatedly compromise their demands for basic equality, while the powerful group refuses to yield any meaningful structural advantage, compromise simply becomes domination disguised as moderation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that phrase domination disguised as moderation explains the deep systemic cynicism so many voters feel today. When you have a massive entrenched power imbalance, a point halfway between equality and systemic oppression is still oppression.
It doesn't magically become justice just because you negotiated it.
Exactly. The text uses the mechanics of voter enfranchisement during the Jim Crow era in the United States to illustrate this.
Oh, that's a powerful example. Walk us through that.
So if marginalized citizens are demanding their constitutional right to vote, and the powerful establishment says, okay, we'll compromise, we are reasonable, you can vote, but only if you pass a highly subjective literacy test and pay a poll tax.
Which is designed specifically for them to fail.
Right. Mechanically, that might look like a concession to an outside observer, but it is not a mutual sacrifice.
Right. The powerful establishment isn't sacrificing anything of value. They're just engineering a more legally sophisticated, moderate-looking mechanism to maintain their absolute dominance over the ballot box.
Precisely. The weaker side is being asked to surrender their demand for actual sweeping justice, merely to preserve a quiet, manageable peace for the powerful class. Therefore, according to the source, you cannot evaluate any political compromise in a vacuum.
You have to look at the context.
You must always examine the background conditions. Who holds the leverage? Who controls the capital? And most importantly, who is actually paying the human cost of delaying full justice?
And the analysis takes this concept of power dynamics and leverage to its ultimate, most terrifying extreme. It talks about the operational difference between negotiating with a normal democratic opponent versus negotiating with an authoritarian movement.
Yes, and this is perhaps the single most vital red line in the entire framework. Context dictates everything. In a healthy, functioning democratic system, political compromise involves negotiating over outcome.
Like the budget.
Right. You debate tax rates, you debate the specifics of environmental regulations, you debate the allocation of federal budgets. But negotiating with an authoritarian movement involves entirely different existential stakes. The text makes it clear that authoritarians do not just want to alter the policy outcomes, they want to fundamentally dismantle the rules of the game itself.
So how does that play out mechanically? What does an authoritarian compromise actually look like?
It rarely looks like a dramatic coup. It looks like a slow, technical dismantling of checks and balances. They won't ask to abolish democracy overnight. They will ask for a compromise on the retirement age of judges.
Oh, which technically forces out independent jurists and allows them to pack the courts.
Exactly. Or they might ask for concessions on how electoral commissions are funded, subtly weakening election integrity over time. They might demand the temporary suspension of certain press freedoms in the name of national security.
Always in the name of something that sounds reasonable.
Always. And the absolute rule established by the source here is this. You can compromise endlessly on policy, but you must never, under any circumstances, compromise away the structural institutions that make peaceful disagreement possible.
Because if you give up the independent courts, or the free press, or the transparent ballot boxes, you are literally chopping down the only bridge that allows for future negotiations. You are compromising away the mechanism of compromise itself.
Exactly. The entire philosophy of political compromise fundamentally relies on a bedrock of institutional rules, civil rights, and the guarantee of the peaceful transfer of power. If you negotiate those foundational pillars away in the desperate hope of securing a temporary, quiet peace with an authoritarian, you destroy the very system that makes any future resistance possible. Negotiation itself ceases to exist.
It just becomes capitulation.
Total surrender.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of theoretical ground here. We've mapped out the structural necessity of pluralism, the psychological dangers of the purity trap, the critical distinction between temporary steps and permanent surrenders, and the terrifying mechanics of domination disguised as moderation.
A lot to process.
It is. But I want to pivot to the practical application of all this. How do you and I, sitting in our living rooms, actually use this information? When the listener sees a breaking news alert on their phone that a massive, controversial piece of legislation has just passed, how do they apply this framework in real time?
To do that effectively, the source suggests we have to train ourselves to look past the political theater and focus entirely on what it calls the moral cost of the compromise.
The moral cost.
Because a serious systemic compromise is never cost-free. Energy and resources are always being shifted. Someone, somewhere in the system, is losing something. The morally responsible citizen must learn to look past the podium speeches and ask who specifically is paying the price for this deal.
And this is where the obfuscation happens. Politicians are absolute masters at hiding the moral cost behind incredibly dense technical language.
Oh, they are artists at it.
Right. When they announce a compromise, they don't say, we secured this infrastructure funding by cutting food assistance for 50,000 single mothers. They stand up and say, we have achieved a bipartisan consensus by implementing a localized adjustment of the eligibility thresholds to ensure long-term fiscal solvency.
Exactly.
It sounds like an accounting adjustment. It is mathematically designed to not sound like hungry people.
And that deliberate obfuscation, the text argues, is exactly what corrodes the system from the inside out. A compromise only remains morally defensible when its burdens are made visible to the public.
People need to see the cost.
Yes. If a sweeping budget deal requires a reduction in benefits for a vulnerable population, the sheer human cost of that reduction cannot be allowed to disappear behind a smokescreen of technical jargon. When the political elites on both sides celebrate a historic bipartisan agreement, while marginalized groups quietly, invisibly absorb the physical harm of that agreement, it shatters the foundation of the democratic structure.
Which brings us to the mechanics of trust. You cannot have a functioning system of compromise if the voters constantly feel like they're being tricked by fiscal sleight of hand.
Trust is the absolute currency of compromise. If both factions believe the other will honor the terms of the agreement and remain transparent about the costs, taking the political risk of compromise is much easier.
Because you aren't afraid of being backstabbed.
Right. But when deals are routinely broken, or when the true devastating costs are hidden in the fine print, it triggers a catastrophic downward spiral. Low institutional trust drastically reduces the willingness of any side to compromise.
And then that lack of compromise increases political gridlock and hostility.
And that escalating hostility destroys whatever microscopic fragments of trust were left. To break that death spiral, the source insists you need radical transparency, strict accountability, and highly reliable institutions that actually enforce the terms of the deals.
Let's give the listener something incredibly concrete to take away from this. The analysis provides a highly specific 6-question framework for evaluating any political deal.
It's a fantastic tool.
I want us to run through these in detail. Let's construct a hypothetical scenario to test this out.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a massive national housing and zoning bill. It promises to build millions of affordable homes. But to get the votes, the progressive faction had to compromise with a conservative, corporate-backed faction.
Very common scenario.
Right. The final deal includes massive tax breaks for wealthy developers, and it strips away several localized eviction protections to, quote, streamline the market. It's a huge, messy, complex deal. How does the listener evaluate if this is a necessary step forward or a toxic betrayal? What is question number 1?
Question 1 is the foundational test. Is the principle negotiable?
Okay, is it negotiable?
You have to look at the housing bill and ask whether the politicians are bargaining over policy details, like the specific percentage of the developer tax break or the geographic allocation of the zoning permits, or if they are bargaining away fundamental human rights.
Right, the absolute boundaries we talked about earlier.
Exactly. If the bill simply adjusts tax incentives to spur building, that is a negotiable policy preference. But if the bill includes a provision that allows developers to bypass civil rights laws or use arbitrary violence to clear homeless encampments without due process, that crosses into fundamental rights. If it touches non-negotiable human dignity, the compromise is inherently toxic.
So policy mechanics are flexible, fundamental human dignity is not. That is a clear line. What is question 2?
Question 2 examines the leverage. Is it reciprocal?
Reciprocal. Okay, so who's giving what?
Look at the factions involved in this housing bill. Are both the progressive housing advocates and the corporate developers actually giving something of value? Or is this a situation where the massively wealthy developers are just demanding deregulation and tax cuts, while the housing advocates are forced to surrender their core demands just to get a few token units built? If the powerful side concede nothing of substance, it fails the test of reciprocity.
That is the domination disguises moderation test in action. If the billionaires are just getting richer while calling it a compromise, it's a failure. Okay, question 3.
Question 3 tracks the human toll. Who bears the cost?
Always the big question.
Are the most vulnerable people in society being asked to sacrifice disproportionately for the sake of an agreement negotiated by secure, wealthy elites? In our housing scenario, if the bill is passed by stripping away eviction protections, the cost of that historic compromise is being paid entirely by the low-income renters who will now be thrown out on the street.
While the politicians celebrate.
Exactly. If the people who have the absolute least leverage are paying the highest price for the compromise, it is deeply morally suspect.
It goes right back to the children losing their food programs while the politicians eat steak. The people at the podium never bear the cost of the deals they strike. That is crucial to watch for. Question 4.
Question 4 focuses on material reality. Does it actually reduce serious harm?
Okay, so does it work?
Right. Will this housing bill, despite its ugly tax breaks and its stripped-down protections, produce a genuinely better, measurable outcome in the real world? Will a significant number of unhoused people actually get a roof over their heads? Or is the bill so watered down and the loopholes for developers so massive that it is merely a cosmetic change?
The 5% release valve we talked about.
Exactly. We have to ask if the deal allows politicians to claim a victory on the campaign trail without actually fixing the underlying suffering.
Are we actually throwing the imperfect green life preserver to save a drowning person, or are we just rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking ship to look busy? I love that test. What is question 5?
Question 5 looks at the time horizon. Does it preserve future democratic possibilities?
Temporary versus permanent.
Yes. Does this housing deal leave room for the issue to be revisited? Can the eviction protections be fought for and reinstated in the next legislative session? Or does the bill contain poison pills that permanently preempt local governments from ever passing renter protections again? A healthy compromise must always leave the structural door open for future, continued debate and improvement.
It cannot lock in the injustice permanently. And the final question, number 6.
Question 6 demands accountability. Is it publicly defensible?
Can they defend it?
Can the leaders who negotiated this housing deal stand in front of the public, specifically the public most negatively affected by the lost eviction protections, and explain honestly why the compromise was necessary? Can they clearly and transparently articulate what core principle was preserved, what painful concessions had to be made, and what tangible good was achieved to justify that pain?
So, what does this all mean? If a politician is pressed by a journalist on why they abandoned their core campaign promise to protect renters, and they cannot clearly, honestly answer those 6 questions.
If they just deflect.
Right. If their only real answer, once you strip away all the focus group to jargon and the spin, boils down to, well, it helped us maintain our majority, or it helped me win my reelection campaign,
Right.
then it isn't pragmatism. It is not structural flexibility. It is just raw, cynical opportunism.
Exactly. The text makes it clear. The more a political deal meets the criteria of those 6 questions, the more it operates as a democratic virtue. It acts as the necessary flex in the skyscraper. But the more it fails those tests, the more it operates as a toxic betrayal of the public trust.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to try and synthesize the sheer volume of what we've covered, because we have taken our listeners on quite a complex analytical journey today.
We really have. I think the most important synthesis to absorb from this framework is that politics, at its core, is fundamentally the art of living with profound imperfection.
It's never going to be perfect.
Never. It takes place among deeply flawed, imperfect people who are operating with incomplete information, constantly trying to balance intensely conflicting values. No single political community, no matter how advanced, is ever going to perfectly, flawlessly realize one single person's pure moral vision.
So true political maturity requires accepting the reality of that structural imperfection.
Yes. But with the massive, vital caveat that maturity does not mean accepting everything. The true challenge of being a responsible citizen and a moral leader is cultivating the analytical ability to distinguish between a necessary, pragmatic imperfection and an unacceptable, soul-crushing injustice.
And that's not easy.
It's incredibly hard. Making that distinction requires immense judgment, profound humility, and incredible courage. If I had to extract the deepest, most resonant principle from this entire philosophical exploration, it would be this: compromise is morally valuable and functionally necessary when we negotiate our preferences.
Our preferences.
Yes, it becomes morally dangerous and inherently destructive when we negotiate away the equal dignity of human beings.
That is the definitive line right there. Preferences versus dignity. It makes me reflect on the impossible burden we place on our political leaders.
Oh, we ask the impossible of them.
We really do. We basically demand that they possess 2 entirely contradictory psychological traits at the exact same time. We demand that they possess the flexibility and the humility to bend so that the machinery of government doesn't become paralyzed and collapse under the weight of pluralism.
Right.
But we simultaneously demand that they possess the absolute spine, the rigidity, and the moral courage to refuse, so that their leadership doesn't devolve into hollow, opportunistic emptiness.
It is a nearly impossible tightrope to walk. Too much flexibility and you stand for absolutely nothing. You become a weather vane for whoever holds the most power. Too much rigidity and you accomplish absolutely nothing. You become an isolated fanatic. True political wisdom is the rare ability to know exactly which trait is required in any given high-stakes moment.
We've spent this entire deep dive analyzing how politicians navigate these impossible choices, how they balance unequal power dynamics, and how they justify their backroom deals. But as we close today, let's turn that analytical lens away from the halls of power and focus it entirely on you,
The listener.
The framework we explored today fundamentally asks what principles should never, ever be subjected to compromise. So I want you to think deeply about your own internal architecture. What is the one core principle you hold so tightly, so absolutely, that you would genuinely rather see the entire political system grind to a complete catastrophic halt than see it compromised away?
That's a heavy question to ponder.
It is. Think about what that ultimate red line is for you. And here is the real kicker to leave you with. Do the people in your society who you completely fundamentally disagree with feel the exact same absolute certainty about a completely different contradictory principle? How does a shared democracy survive when millions of people's non-negotiable red lines inevitably collide?
That is the defining question of our time.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. Keep questioning the system, keep analyzing the deals, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.